Thank you for this opportunity. Nice to see everybody here. Israel 365 is an organization, or as Christians say, a ministry, that I started when I moved to Israel, when I made Aliyah 13 years ago. It's based on Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 12, that says, Israel is not like Egypt. Israel is a land that God's eyes are upon every day from the beginning of the year till the end of the year. And when I read that verse, it really struck me that, we all try to be more like God, and the Bible tells us exactly what God does on a daily basis. So Israel 365 helps people connect every day to Israel.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I'll hand over.
All right, well, thank you for the introduction, and welcome to Jerusalem, everybody. I just wanted to maybe dedicate my remarks and say a few words about my beloved grandmother who passed away this week. And we had really the honor, there's a custom in the Jewish community, which everything we do, all of the customs that we have really do go back to the Bible in some direct or even indirect way. And because the patriarchs all wanted to be buried in Israel, right? Abraham buried his wife in Hebron, and they were all, Isaac, Jacob, everybody cared passionately, not only of living here in Israel, but also being buried here. And there's a verse in Psalms that said, I'll tell you exactly what verse it is, but it says in Hebrew, Etalech be'eretz hachayim, that I will walk. It's Psalms. Can't find it here. Psalms. Sorry about that. 16 verse 11, where it says, I will walk with God in the land of the living. Israel is called Eretz HaChaim, the land of the living. And so there's this idea that by being buried in Israel, you are connecting to eternity. And we also have this notion that we believe fervently in the arrival of the Messiah and in the resurrection of the dead, and that it's sort of even just easier and more convenient to be buried here in Israel, where the Messiah is going to come and where the resurrection will take place. So we buried my grandmother in Israel near Jerusalem in Beit Shemesh, where I'm from, and she was a very special woman. She was a Holocaust survivor. She grew up in what is now Ukraine and was 94 years old, but during the Holocaust, she was a teenager, and she lived through, the concentration camps and the worst of anti-Semitism and hate. But she remained somebody who was always very optimistic and always very positive. And just, because all of her grandchildren really loved her very much, and we would ask her to tell us her stories, and she did tell us those stories. We actually wrote those stories down in a book, so we would always have them for our kids and their kids. One of, so many stories. I'll just share with you one, that the neighborhood that she lived in there were a lot of Jews in that city, but obviously most of the people there were non-Jews, and there was very good relations for hundreds of years between the Jews and the Gentiles. And then when Hitler came to power, so it unleashed this demonic spirit of anti-Semitism. And it wasn't overnight, but very quickly, within 2 years, their neighbors became raging anti-Semites and forced would come into their homes and take whatever they want. They would abuse the women. They would steal their animals. They would, and then eventually they kicked the Jewish people from her town, was called Chust, and they moved them into a ghetto. And as they were walking and marching, this march of shame across the town, that not only did they grow up in, but their parents grew up in, their grandparents grew up in, their great-grandparents grew up in a small village in Europe. Their neighbors who were friends with them were throwing things at them and saying, Juden to Palestina, Jews back to Palestine. You don't belong here. You belong in Palestine. And obviously, now we're going through a similar explosion of anti-Semitism, and the anti-Semites are saying that you're occupiers here in the land of Israel. So I'm just saying that, it's so nice to be with friends who understand how important Israel is and who appreciate the Jewish people and are standing with us against anti-Semitism. Friends, that's really unique in all of Jewish history. What my grandmother experienced was the norm. That was the reality for thousands of years of Jewish, Christian, Jews living in Christian countries. And the fact that now, after the Holocaust, after this explosion of evil and this explosion of hate, and then God brought us out like from the valley of dry bones back to the land of Israel, and we are here, and thanks to God, we are strong. Now, for the first time, really, Christians are turning and recognizing that great miracle that God has done for the Jewish people. God has done great things for the Jewish people, like it says in Psalms 126, and we are, grateful for your friendship, grateful for your encouragement, and grateful for your support. So I just wanted to share with you a few ideas about the focus that those of us who are involved with Jewish-Christian relations here in Israel recognize that, especially after the war, the first focus of the couple of months after the war broke out, we were all very much focused on the emergency needs and the humanitarian needs that were overwhelming. So many dead, so many murdered, so many injured, so many devastated, and the needs were overwhelming. It was a surprise attack. Nobody was expecting it, and there were tens of thousands of people evicted from their homes, and so the needs were overwhelming, and we all jumped into action to provide as much as we could. But then after those needs were taken care of, we shifted the focus and we shifted a little bit more towards taking a step back and saying, well, what needs to be done on a larger scale? Obviously, this is not only a military fight, this is a information war and a spiritual battle. The spiritual battle is something that is first and foremost, and we need prayer, we need to pray. But when it comes to the information war, right, so how do we battle this information war against Israel's very legitimacy? Where does the issue of our illegitimacy even come from? Well, it comes from this narrative that has been perpetuated and accepted as conventional wisdom for the last many decades, that this land is still contested. And yes, there's Israel, but there are also the Palestinians, and yes, there's a Jewish state, but there will also needs to be a Palestinian state. And so we realized that the illegitimacy and a battle over our very legitimacy comes from the notion of there being a Palestinian state one day here in this land. And so we focused the attention on fighting and pushing back against the narrative of a Palestinian state. Because if anything, October 7th demonstrated that the Palestinian people cannot be in charge of their own state here in Israel. They can outside of Israel. In fact, Jordan already is a Palestinian state. But they certainly, October 7th made it crystal clear, even to the left-wing liberal element of Israeli, Israel is a pretty liberal country, as you all see the outside of the hotels, what's going on today. But after October 7th, even the liberals in Israel said, okay, forget it. Palestinian statehood is totally off the table. Yet, at the same time, the American government, the American administration, and many other nations around the world started coming to the exact opposite conclusion. I mean, they had the conclusion before October 7th, but they said, see, this attack proves that there needs to be a Palestinian state. And so we started a coalition called Keep God's Land. Keep God's Land. It's a coalition of Jews and Christians working together not only for Israel, but specifically for greater Israel, for Israel and Judea and Samaria. Because since Oslo, and I was a kid during Oslo, it was in the early 90s, so I was young at the time, But I remember there being a lot of opposition in the Jewish community. Like, how could you divide God's land? How could you give away God's land? But then it passed, and they signed the peace treaty in the Rose Garden and since then, the early 90s, it's been accepted wisdom that we need to go forward towards Palestinian statehood. And even though the terms were violated really on day one by the Palestinian Arab side of things, nevertheless, there was so much enthusiasm for the idea that everybody overlooked all of the violations from day one. And they would get bigger and bolder and more egregious until this explosion, the earthquake of October 7th. Keep God's Land is meant to say, okay, time out. This is done. This is over. And instead of trying to battle the notion of a two-state solution, or what we would call a two-state delusion, instead of trying to fight that with political arguments or legal arguments or historical arguments, this coalition of Jews and Christians said, you know what we at least can all agree on? That it's an issue of faith. That God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people, and it doesn't belong to us. We're just stewards. It's his land, that he wanted us to be here and us to be in the land. And so it's God's land. And that pretty much all Jews and all Christians who are faithful can and should be able to recognize. And so that's what Keep God's Land is all about. Thank you. And I see that we focused our energy on America because that's Israel 365. We have a company with 25 employees, and we're all pretty much Americans who moved to Israel. So that's sort of our focus, but there are a lot of Europeans here who are here, and so if there are perhaps opportunities to bring this to Europe, I understand it's a little bit more complicated, and so we focused on America, but it doesn't have to stay that way. There are 3 pillars of Keep God's Land. We have a great website, by the way, keepgodsland.com, and the 3 pillars of Keep God's Land are education, advocacy, and prayer. Each division, each department is led by both a rabbi and a pastor. This really is meant to be a true partnership and a coalition. And each division is led by a rabbi and a pastor. It starts really with education because a lot of people will refer to the West Bank without even recognizing how offensive that is. Words are really important, right? It's silly even to say such a thing, but it needs to be emphasized sometimes that words are really, really important, right? The biggest example that comes up in Jewish-Christian relations is that many Christians will refer to the Bible as the New Testament or in the Old Testament, right? And when I started working with Christians about 13 years ago, so I would hear a lot of times Old Testament, or we have in our New Testament, you have in your Old Testament, and I would kind of flinch. And eventually I had the courage to say to my new Christian friends, I don't love that terminology, New Testament and Old Testament. New Testament is fine, but Old Testament, to me as a Jew, you're saying you have your Old Testament. There's a trace of replacement theology in that terminology because it implies that the Torah is old and has been replaced and it has been surpassed. And most of the times when I would point that out to my Christian friends, they had no idea. They didn't realize it, and they certainly didn't mean to be offensive. And so very quickly we would, teach people that we call it Tanakh. Why Tanakh? It stands for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. The 3 pillars of the Hebrew Bible are the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and Ketuvim are the writings, the later prophets and the writings. So when it comes to the language of West Bank, so that also is something that is very intentionally misleading, because it sounds like a little sliver of land alongside the bank of the Jordan River, the West Bank of the Jordan River, like a little strip of land, right? But there's two big problems with it. Number one is that it's not a little strip of land. It is almost half of the size of the state of Israel, first of all. And the land that Israel is left with outside of the West Bank is dangerously narrow. And as you'll see, if you're going tomorrow with Zach Waller on the trip to the Shomron, to Samaria, to their headquarters, the Hayovel headquarters on Har Bracha, you'll see how close the Jews and the Arabs live, and you'll see how close the Arab villages are overlooking the airport, overlooking Tel Aviv. It's not just the west bank of the Jordan River, it's half of the land of Israel. So that's one problem, is that it's intentionally misleading that it's a tiny little area of land. And also, it refers to Israel as the bank of the Jordan River. And like the equivalent really would be to call Texas North Mexico, right? Or to call New York South Canada, right? No, this is our state. We have sovereignty. Don't refer to Eastern Israel as the West Bank of Jordan. It's deeply offensive, and it denies the sovereignty of Israel. And so the preferred terminology that we try to educate people, that Keep God's Land is meant to educate people, is the preferred terminology is Yehuda v'Shomron, or Judea and Samaria. Judea and Samaria. That's not my terminology. That's God's terminology. That's the language of the Bible. So we need to explain that to people. Most people don't even realize it. And then the second pillar is advocacy. Advocacy is that we're realizing how important it is to educate the next generation, but then to put all of that into practice and to get out into the street and to walk the halls of Congress in order to advocate for our position. So the second part of Keep God's Land is advocacy. And some of the things that we've done since we launched in February at the National Religious Broadcasters NRB conference in Nashville is we've done a number of things in the realm of advocacy. First of all, and I'm sorry that Troy Miller is not here this minute. He was with you until now. But Troy Miller is the president of the NRB. And at the NRB convention in February, we worked with him, and they passed a resolution, a really important resolution called the Biblical Heartland Accuracy in Media Resolution, that encouraged all of Christian media to refer to the correct terminology and not to, even by accident, refer to it as the West Bank, or certainly not the occupied territories, but to refer to the land as Judea and Samaria. And on behalf of 1,600 Christian media outlets, the NRB passed the Biblical Heartland Resolution. Yeah, it's an amazing achievement. Since we did that, the next step was we had an event in Washington, D.C. We had a subsequent event in Nashville again, and we've had events in Jerusalem at the Knesset. Just this week, actually, we were at the Knesset and showing this resolution to different Knesset members and going around Judea and Samaria and letting them know, that people like who are here also today, Yossi Dagan, who is the mayor of the Shomron region. So he didn't even realize how big the support of Judea and Samaria truly is. And that's something that we can't take it for granted anymore, especially just this week, 3 countries recognized Palestinian statehood. Norway, Ireland, and Spain recognize Palestinian statehood, with many more who are on the way if there's not a significant amount of pushback. And so it's extremely important to advocate for Judea and Samaria as much as possible. And we're working at the highest levels in the Jewish community and Christian faith leaders. And a lot of Jews are very well connected politically, and a lot of Christian leaders are very well connected politically. At the head of our movement is Michelle Bachman, who is also the head of one of the heads of the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast. And one of the other heads of Keep God's Land is Ambassador David Friedman, who's obviously very close with President Trump. And because Ambassador Friedman has been out there with Keep God's Land and with this message of Judea and Samaria way before Keep God's Land, so he is getting the attention of the Trump campaign, and he's getting the attention of President Trump. And so we've had a lot of influence directly and indirectly into the Trump campaign, so much so that a few weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, there was a long interview with President Trump in Time magazine. And President Trump basically said that he no longer supports the idea of a two-state solution. That's a real wow. It's a huge news. People need to understand that, and people need to advocate that more politicians, more elected officials need to understand the issue and need to uphold that when they get elected into office. We're on the cusp of either, God forbid, the world's governments forcing a two-state solution on Israel, or finally, once and for all, abandoning the notion, this two-state delusion, this dangerous and really demented idea that we could give away God's land. The final pillar of Keep God's Land, like I mentioned before, is prayer. Nothing would happen in this world if we don't storm the heavens. And that's really the most important thing that we could all do, is to pray about it, and to pray in our churches, and to tell our pastors and tell our rabbis that this is something very, very important. So there's a lot of opportunities for all of you to be our representatives in your community for Keep God's Land. And the name of this talk was Keep God's Land to Make Judea and Samaria Great Again, because we're really hoping that just like for America to continue to be blessed, for all of the countries around the world to continue to be blessed, so those countries need to bless Israel, and God forbid the opposite. And the opposite really would be to give into the false narrative of the Palestinians that it doesn't belong to us, that it belongs to them, and to bring upon the judgment of Joel 4. Joel 4 in verse 2 says that I will gather all the nations and bring them to the valley of Jehoshaphat, where I will judge them for their treatment of my people Israel, which they scattered among the nations for dividing my land. That would be such a terrible curse upon all of us if that were to happen on our watch and in our lifetime. And we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. Just want to conclude with an idea that we're in the 76th year of Israel. And I know a lot of people here probably are a little prophecy-oriented, prophecy-minded. What is the significance of the number 76? I'll share with you an idea that's based on Leviticus 26. Leviticus 26:42, which we're reading this week in synagogue this Shabbat. And it's talking about all of the curses that will happen if we're not faithful to God. And then there's a promise at the end. And the promise is as follows: I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. It's a beautiful verse, but the rabbis say, well, it's actually a very strange verse. It's rather very unusual, because it should be that I will remember my covenant with Abraham, my covenant with Isaac, my covenant with Jacob. But instead it says, I will remember my covenant with Jacob, my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. So what's the idea? Why does it go backwards? And one of the reasons that they say is to emphasize the importance of building upon the gifts of the previous generation. God is saying, I will not forget you, Israel, and I will remember you because of Jacob. And even if you disappoint me, I will remember you because of Isaac. And God says, and even if you still stray from me, I won't abandon you because of Abraham. And if you still don't get the message, Jewish people, because sometimes we're a little stubborn and we don't always get the message, I will remember you because of the land of Israel. 76, friends, is the year that God remembers his eternal covenant with the land of Israel. 76, this year, is the year of the eternal covenant of the land. And I just encourage each and every one of you to join us and to do everything you can to help keep God's land. I'm so grateful, really, to Albert Wexler for arranging this Jerusalem prayer breakfast this year. This would have been a very easy year to have said, we're going to postpone, we're going to cancel. A lot of things were canceled. But Albert said, no, this is the year we need to do it. And all of you could have also said, I don't know, it's a little dangerous, right? The media makes it all sound like there's this, it's very dangerous. But all of you who are here, and I'm sure you got a lot of flack from your friends and from your family, not the year to come to Israel, but the fact that you came here this year, you demonstrated that God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people, and we are all going to do everything that we can to protect God's land and to keep God's land. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Tuli. That's been excellent and most helpful. Have you got a website that people can go to?
Oh, do I have a website that
I'm
people
sure
can
you
go
do.
to? Which one?
Which
we have
one?
Israel365.com. We have keepgodsland.com. We have the israelbible.com. We have Israel365news.com. I think that might be it.
That's enough. Okay, please see him if you need any further help with that. But thank you so much. That's been most helpful.
Thank you, James.